How does an Air Force prepare for a future conflict? Well, it seems like an easy question. You just have to get the planes ready, you have to get the equipment, the stockpiles ready, you have to train your operators, and off you go. But once you actually start digging deeper, preparing your Air Force is quite a challenging proposition, from doctrinal conversations all the way to procurement. So in this video, I want to talk exactly about this question and break that open a little bit by talking with Dr. Sophy Antrobus from the Freeman Air and Space Institute of King's College London. She's an absolute expert on exactly this question and the sort of conversations that have to be had in order to prepare an Air Force from the manpower over to the equipment. And without further ado, you know what? Let's just jump right into it. This conversation on military aviation history is made in cooperation with the Freeman Air and Space Institute, King's College London.
I wanted to start off with sort of the war in Ukraine a little bit, and that has set off a very sort of public conversation in my own country, Germany, of course. I also know that it's been the same in Britain, but it's been set off that conversation about how militaries sort of need to prepare to a certain degree for conflict. And we've just come out of this period where all Western air forces were doing was essentially coin operations like counterinsurgency, Afghanistan, Iraq. And what would you say now, given what is happening in Ukraine, given where the current state of Western air forces is at the moment, are they really prepared for what is going on at the moment?
That's a challenging question, and well, it's interesting because I think my answer revolves around deterrence to an extent, and specifically resilience. And in resilience terms, there are certain countries, and I'd say the UK is one, that have no real long-term memory of what resilience means. In terms of serving age of people, so people who are actually in the military, even those who are at the ends of their careers can barely remember, sort of the Cold War style armed forces. I think in places like, for example, Sweden, where after Russia's sort of activities 2014 onwards, Sweden sort of quite impressively said, we really need to give this some more thought. We've let this drift, started their sort of total defense program, and were saying, we've just spent the last 15 years diverted by counterinsurgency type operations, and we need as a country to do better, and I commend them for that. And they did have more of a corporate memory, I think, or an internal memory of the importance of it. When I talk about resilience, and when I talk about the air forces in particular, or our air force in the UK, it's lots of people are talking about things like stockpiles of weapons. Okay, so we're all going to want to replace stockpiles that we're giving to Ukraine. We all buy them from a few manufacturers. Everybody's going to need that. And they're talking about supply lines and taking lessons from how Ukraine and Russia have both managed those kind of issues. But I think it's much deeper than that. Resilience to me is about mindset. It's in everything you do. And I think that the armed services, and in this case, the Royal Air Force, they're starting to think about it now. But I think it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about what underpins getting aircraft into the air to do the job that they're supposed to do. And rather than seeing logistics and concepts as kind of almost not secondary, because I know nobody would say that they see them as secondary, but actually concentrating on capability in the air, missing that emphasis. And I think it comes down to that, really, for me.
It's fascinating, this question of resilience. I recently spoke with somebody who was doing hybrid warfare, and he essentially said the same thing. We have to be prepared, or like think about resilience more in terms of not just the military, but as a societal concept in itself. But if we look at sort of the connection between society and the military, and we go into recruitment, right? So yes, it goes back into the discussion of how much manpower do we have, how much staff is there actually available, what platforms are being able to be operated, what are the operational readiness percentages that always get compared. But what would you say are the current challenges in really getting the crews and the manpower and the staff that is really required to run an air force? And how can, if there are really severe challenges in getting the people into the air force, how can these be tackled?
So challenges of getting crews and staff and personnel into the air force are several fold. First of all, we're well aware that the job market's competitive now, that there are lots of opportunities, there's very low unemployment. So the competition is harder, I think. For the Air Force in particular, the majority of the people that the Air Force want to recruit are people that are pretty well qualified. Quite a few specializations or areas need people with quite technical skills, engineering skills, that kind of thing. And increasingly, you mentioned hybrid warfare. There's obviously the sort of whole cyber side of things as well. So you've got a smallish pool of those people. I might as well mention the B word and Brexit. Clearly that means that there are less people coming from abroad, perhaps, to participate in that market. And for defence, who even if some people are allowed on a skills-based sort of immigration policy, actually the defence bit has to really recruit mainly from obviously British citizens, and therefore their pool's still difficult. I think in terms of how forces address it, the Royal Air Force is doing something really interesting in the way that it's thinking about specifically net zero and the target of net zero 2040, which is a very challenging goal in many ways, and creating quite a lot of difficulty in terms of finding a path, a roadmap to reaching that. But the intent is important for a reason that's not often articulated, which is that we know that young people are interested in going into business, industry, organizations that do care about the planet, that do care about the climate crisis, and are prepared to and are doing something about it. And that's not just a sort of a page on the website under corporate social responsibility that lists a couple of trees that they've replanted or something. It's everything. And so if you've got people who want to go into engineering, maybe aviation engineering, they've got a lot of choices. They've got the civil side, they've got defence, commercial, and then militaries. And actually, for the Air Force to show that it is serious, really serious, about taking responsibility for its contribution to climate change, I think that actually is a more important element in its attractiveness than I think people sometimes give it credit for.
And with this sort of attractiveness, obviously, once the people are in the force, there is training, right? Are we seeing that sort of the way that the Royal Air Force has done its training and has maintained its standing force and has been able to really overcome certain bottlenecks, perhaps, in this regard? Has that really changed over let's say, since the Cold War?
I'll talk, if I may, about training specifically in terms of flying training, because I think that's
Sure.
a very interesting and complex example, but it applies elsewhere as well. The current situation with flying training in the UK is not good. People are waiting long times for courses, and an awfully long time in some cases to get to the operational conversion unit and onto the front line. That is partly, and really the problems at the moment are very much exacerbated by the fact that the front line is full. People have stayed in the Air Force or rejoined because of COVID and the pandemic, because the aviation, some of them have moved over to different parts of aviation, and that didn't look too good a couple of years ago. And for various other reasons to do with sort of economic uncertainty as well. People are just less predisposed to leave what is a good, reasonably well-paid job for what might look like a much riskier future on the outside. So there's that problem, and that just means that there's a queue, and it's not going away anytime soon. But on top of that, something that I think has changed, it has changed since the Cold War, is that there's been a drive in that. This is true of all sorts of parts of the military, government, everywhere, a drive for efficiency over flexibility. So the way that the Ministry of Defence contracted out the military flying training system, as it's now called, was done on the basis of producing the right amount, no more, no less in theory, of aircrew at the right times. And if there's no flexibility or no fat in the system, if you like, then that makes it quite worrying in the military terms, because if for example we're involved in, for argument's sake, in a couple of years in fighting a major conflict, we can't buy 20 more F-35s and just order them, we'll have them next week, because we think, oh goodness, we need a few more platforms. Really, where you can do stuff is around the logistics and resilience and around perhaps more crews. Now, if you've got a system where you can't turn that tap on and make it run a bit harder, then you're setting yourself up for potential failure. So I think that there's the aspects of this current situation which probably will change. People will decide that they've reached the end of their careers in the Air Force and they want to go and do things differently. Commercial aviation is picking up, as we well know. So I think that sort of an immediate dynamic will change. But the underlying issue of a contract that's no longer, there's a privately run, that's not really, it's no longer internally managed by the Air Force alone. And the fact that contract's written to be extremely taut, I think is problematic.
It's that sort of spreadsheet outsourcing logic that we've seen for a decade now, but that's sort of coming back now to haunt us a little bit there.
And it's understandable, but
yes.
It's happened in all sorts of areas. It's not just this area, but I think it has particular implications. Yeah,
absolutely. And earlier you already mentioned sort of this net zero 2040. As sort of increasing the attractiveness of the force and actually what sort of the effect that has on potentially recruitment. I'm just wondering, do you have any sort of other less well-known aspects that you believe deserve a lot more attention that they're getting when it comes to setting up sort of that competent foundation for Western military air force, or Western style military air force?
I mean, competent foundation is it's just like the ultimate nirvana. I mean, yes. I think the difficulty is that we can't rebuild everything from scratch. That I think that's the eternal problem. All you are is working with a current institution that's got its flaws and difficulties and challenges, some of which we've just discussed, and then trying to change it a bit, but you can't change it fundamentally. I think the two things that are being talked about in the Air Force, I'm not saying the Air Force is not listening or isn't aware, are first thinking beyond platform-centricity and pilot-centricity. And that's not just because it skews thinking, it's also because actually, to be honest, in 50 years' time, there will be some, I believe there will be some aircraft that are still crewed, but there'll be so few air crew relative to all the other elements of the Air Force, that if you continue to pick, to put them on a pedestal above other branches, other types of specialization, you're ending up poking from an extremely small pool, and that's never a good idea. So there's kind of that platform thing. And I think the other thing is about listening to different voices. Again, I think militaries generally, one thing they're not very good at listening to are younger voices in academia. So people, and I'm sure there are people listening to your podcast in exactly this position, who are, early in their career, thinking about defense, security, military, strategic studies, war studies, whatever. And in general, military institutions tend to prefer to listen to maybe a retired senior officer with experience, a veteran, obviously in inverted commas, battle hardened in inverted commas, but somebody else who's actually spent, years thinking about these issues, educating themselves about these issues, learning to think critically. They're really important too. And I sometimes feel they have a role to play if they want to. I mean, they may just wish to be critical, and I get that too, but they may have more of a role to play in building that competent foundation than we currently allow them.
Now looking sort of forward, taking on sort of the potential for change there. The future of air forces generally in Europe, right? I've had this conversation with somebody else who said that air forces in Europe, sometimes at the moment, it still seems to be the case that they try to do too much. They have QRA, they have strike, they have anti-access, area denial, electronic warfare, they have reconnaissance tanker, maritime patrol, all these roles and a very tight budget. And either they need a bigger budget, or we need in Europe to find a solution of how do we centralize perhaps certain of these tasks among certain members of either the European Union or of NATO. Do you believe that is feasible? And are there already sort of initiatives that are being carried out in that direction? Or is this something that, especially with Britain, with it being even more complicated now, that is just not happening just yet?
So my view is that it's a really important point. And I have heard certain politicians, for example, talking about us being able to need to defend Britain, being able to need to defend itself as if we may have to fight alone. I think if we prepare with that as the most likely outcome, we're mad, because it might happen, but I think the chances are that we will be fighting with European partners and, of course, NATO allies. And so it makes sense to collaborate. Actually, it's really interesting. Just in early September, the Freeman Air and Space Institute that I belong to hosted at King's a meeting of air and space capability directors. So the European air chiefs were meeting in, I think May it was, and they decided actually if there's going to be some uplift in defence spending, if we are facing really quite a serious threat, particularly from Russia at the moment. I mean, a weakened or strengthened Putin is a more dangerous person. It really, unfortunately, I don't think it matters either way. They both have horrible potential outcomes for us. Then the most important thing is not that everybody goes and buys one air tanker, right? And we end up with a load of air tankers and nothing else. That's a very simplistic way of putting it. And clearly that's not exactly what would happen. But then, so the decision was made that they really should start collaborating and talking. So I'm pleased to say, we had 14 nations, everywhere from Turkey to Greece to Latvia, Finland, Germany, Italy. So, really brilliant mix. And I've probably missed somebody out who'll be really upset I missed them out. So apologies if anybody's listening who was at the conference. But that's really positive, actually, sitting around the table. And I think what's important is at the capability directors level. So these are the people that are deciding and directing and influencing what do we need, what do we need to prioritize. And they're also people that almost certainly will be still in their air forces in 2, 3, 4 years' time, probably a bit more senior. So you're actually getting the right sort of people around the table. So the positive thing is something like that has happened. I mean, I suppose if I was going to be, I don't really want to end on a negative note, but, the fact that this is a new initiative does tell you something. I think it probably tells us a little bit actually about Britain's relationship with Europe over the last few years, and it's just not been seen as something that's possible or doable. And for all the awful wrong reasons of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, actually finally some decent collaboration might be coming out of that. It's sad that it's come to that, but I'm pleased that it's happening.
Well, better now than never.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, at this point, I'm sure viewers are going to be interested in knowing even more about this subject. So where would you send them?
Recently, I gave evidence to the Defence Select Committee. So in front of 8 to 10 politicians who asked, and it was the evidence was about aviation procurement. And I was sat alongside Justin Bronk, who's a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Many people will know of Justin if they're interested in air forces. I would recommend Justin. He writes regularly in all sorts of it's easy to Google Justin and find pieces he's written. He's very good on some of the technical deficiencies. And so what Justin writes, I recommend, but also the evidence that we gave, and there were other evidence sessions around aviation procurement, provide some really interesting discussion. So, I mean, it's not the wildest of, it's not quite Married at First Sight UK. I'm afraid it's not that exciting, but it's not too bad. And then the other thing is just talking about the flying training pipeline. It is still available online. There was a BBC Radio 4 programme put out in 2019 called Winging It, which was looking at the state of the pipeline. Now, things have moved on, so some of the facts or the reasons or it's pre-pandemic, but actually it's an interesting take on the state of pipelines. And actually it focuses a bit on the human impact, which I didn't really discuss much earlier, but actually at the end of the day, these are young men and women who have been on a hold system for maybe 8 years, of the whole of their 20s practically. When you think if you did that in any other career or profession, you can imagine how demoralizing that would be. And there is a bit of a human aspect to the program that I think
so it's called Winging It by the BBC?
Yes. BBC Radio 4, so people can Google that. It's easy to find.
Okay, I'll also put those in the description below so people can immediately get the link. Fantastic, Sophie. Thank you very, very much. And have a lovely day.
Thank you too. And it's been nice to chat.
So I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. As always, big thank you to Patreons and channel members for their support. And also make sure to check out the description below for a lot of helpful links. For example, the recommendations that were provided by Dr. Antrobus. And as always, have a great day and see you in the sky.